You're listening to the Slavic Literature Pod, your shelf help guide to all things Slavic. I'm Cameron Lolana, and if you want to learn more about Slavic literature, art, and culture, then you're in the right place. Today, we're diving into A School for Fools by Sasha Sokolov. I've tried to find a way to describe this novel adequately, but I can't find it, so let's inadequately call it a discussion between a man, his double, and their dead/not-dead teacher about their life, their love for another teacher, Veta, and how time is not quite what we insist it is. That's not even really getting to a tenth of what I want to say about it, but we'll leave it there for now. To discuss it and its many intricacies, I'm joined by podcast's thrice returnee, I'm sure there's a better word for that, Dr. José Vergara. José is an associate professor of Russian in the Bryn Mawr College's Department of Russian. He's the author of All Future Plunges to the Past, James Joyce in Russian Literature, a co-editor of Reimagining Nabokov, Pedagogies for the 21st Century, and a co-editor of the digital annotated edition of Sasha Sokolov's Between Dog and Wolf, which you can find linked in the description of this episode. Speaking of Reimagining Nabokov, that was what we discussed last time Jose joined us, along with his colleague Sarah Kapukin. You'll find links to that and Jose's other Slavic Lit Pod episode covering Yuri Alesh's envy in relation to James Joyce a little bit in the description. Jose, sorry for the long intro. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. It's wonderful to be back and talking to you about another weird book.
I'm glad you are back. I was thinking earlier today that you are like a specialist in proposing books about the most neurotic people possible on this podcast, and I love it.
That's true. I had not thought about it in those terms before, but I think that's 100% true. And I have this not so original pet theory that we all write about ourselves and are interested in books or the things that we engage with because we're really working through our own issues. So I think you're diagnosing me here.
I'm sorry for putting you through what my psychology major roommate in college did to me.
Perfect.
But for this novel, before we get into talking about A School for Fools itself, Jose, you wanted to talk about this piece because this year, 2026, is the 50th anniversary of its first publication. This podcast is part of your master plot to recognize this incredibly singular work and its author. What else do you have planned that listeners should keep an eye out for?
Yeah, it's not a super cohesive master plot or plan that I have in the works, but a few years ago was another anniversary related to Sokolov, and a friend, Martina Napolitano, and I co-edited a special volume of Canadian American Slavic studies devoted to his second novel, Between Dog and Wolf, to kind of commemorate it. And there's a sort of tradition, I guess, in Sokolov studies of honoring these different anniversaries. Before that special volume, there have been two other previous ones a while ago and not so while ago. So yeah, it just seems like part of this tradition, something that various Sokolov heads like to do occasionally. And yeah, the 50th anniversary strikes me as an important one for this, as you said, a singular work. It's a novel that I think still deserves a wider audience. It's quite strange. It's challenging in certain ways, but it's also very rewarding and very fun. You can read it, and I think we'll talk about this in different ways, but you can read it just sort of straight through, but if you reread it or if you pause and kind of pay attention to more of the details, you'll get different things out of it. So that's really part of my motivation for all things Sokolov that I've pursued, like the annotations to the second novel, Between Dog and Wolf, or the various publications. I'm really just a big fan, and I think other readers can get a lot out of it, and I want that for them. As for other things planned, this podcast, and then thinking about maybe some publications that's nothing concrete, but yeah, it's thinking of this as the year of A School for Fools and what we can do for that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it does deserve it because when I was trying to figure out how to describe it in one word, singular was the only thing that came to mind because this is, I think, one of the, I like to, sometimes when I'm reading, I read out loud just because I like to feel the language. But this was the only one where I had this like very physical reaction to the book where I'd be sitting in a chair or on a couch and I'd hit a section, especially one of those like big long lists that Sokolov deploys throughout the novel, and I'd be like, I have to read this out loud to get a feel for it, and I'd get up and I'd start reading and I'd start pacing, and at some point I'd be like, no, this isn't quite a time. In the same way that sometimes the narrator gets cut off by himself or his double or once the author, or maybe more than once, that I was like, okay, it's no longer time to read out loud. Then I'd just stop, and sometimes I'd sit down, or sometimes I'd keep reading. So I can only imagine what it looked like to watch me reading this in the house. Very a little not typically how I engage with novels, but something about it felt like I just certain parts of the book kind of demanded like, okay, I can't interact with this just as I normally would with a novel here, sitting here quietly with my notebook.
Yeah, that's wonderful, and I suspect Sokolov himself would appreciate that. So much of the novel is about language itself, and
Mm,
it's constructed out of these textures of how words sound in Russian.
mm,
Um, I think the translation tries and
mm,
to approximate some of that. Um, but yeah, it's very rhythmical and these
mm.
repetitions that occur. So it's not a surprise maybe that it led you to read it in this way.
Yeah, yeah. It was a lot of fun too. I got a little exercise in. But as long as we're talking about Sokolov, could you give us an introduction for people who are either hearing about him for the first time or maybe have only like me heard about him in passing?
Yeah, certainly. So Sasha Sokolov is an odd writer in various ways. Um, uh, he is the author of three novels. School for Fools is the first one. Um, Between Dog and Wolf, the second.
Mm,
Palisandria, or as it's translated into English, Astrophobia,
mm,
is the third one. All quite different. But he produced these three novels in the span of, I guess, roughly 12, 13 years. So
mm,
between 1973, when School for Fools started, and then um, the publication of um, Palisandria in the mid 80s. Um, Other than that, he hasn't published very
mm,
much. Some shorter pieces, and a number of essays that were largely originally delivered as lectures. So it's
mm,
quite limited in scope. Um, I think often when we think of writers, um, it's about productivity and how much they
mm,
produce.
mhm,
But in his case, it's quite limited, and yet his influence is vast.
mm,
He's a bit of a writer's writer, is how I usually describe him.
mm,
That Russian writers of at this point, at least a couple, maybe three generations, um, really respect his work,
mm,
sort of worship School for Fools, and I think Between Dog and Wolf in particular for what they did with the Russian language and showed what could be done with it, particularly early on when they were produced in the Soviet era. And,
mm.
we were getting, as I'm sure many of your readers are familiar with, or listeners are familiar with,
Hopefully they're readers
socialist,
too.
yeah, socialist realist works that
Mm,
were really formulaic and boring and dry
mm,
in many cases about, texts about cement plants and so
mm,
on. Um, he changed things in
mm,
so many ways, and the way he works with multiple registers of Russian and um, the expressivity of
mm,
the language that he deploys. Um, so yeah, limited
mm,
output, but sort of outsized influence outside of that. His personal biography, I think, is also quite fascinating. I'll just
mm.
name a few things in there. He was
Yeah.
born in Canada. His parents were um, Soviet spies,
Hmm.
basically, and eventually had to flee Canada when there was sort of expose of another
Mm,
spy, a defection. So they fled, returned to the Soviet Union, to Moscow, So he partly grew up in the Soviet Union, um, and was totally out of place. If his literature is out of place with, most traditional literatures and
Mm.
certainly Soviet literature, he himself felt himself very much out of place in the Soviet Union. So somewhat rebellious and looking for alternatives in terms of um, ways of living and resisting the Soviet model and Soviet way of life. Eventually, he was able to emigrate, and has largely lived a sort of nomadic life. Lived in Vermont, Canada. Um, it seems like last, a few decades at least, sort of spending time between Florida and the colder Canada, and is still writing, but not having very little of what he writes published. Just interested in sort of producing for its own sake, I think. Um, but I will mention, just on a personal level, I've been in touch with him for various projects and things related to his work. But I have found him to be really generous and supportive. We had a lot of questions about Between Dog and Wolf and those annotations for that digital edition, um, and he answered all of them pretty much, and helped clarify certain things in our interpretations and our commentaries. Um, so yeah, there's spy parents, there's defections and exile and all these things. I think, really fascinating life that probably deserves its own novel as well.
Yeah, right. And it's amazing too to be able to do the work you're doing when with an author. I was debating whether or not to put this line in the intro of like one of the few authors we have that's around, that's a modern author that's around today. And yeah, it must be very. Cause I've often with works kind of like the one in the annotated or bibliography, I guess, for Between Dog and Wolf. For older books, I'm like, man, that would have been an incredible amount of work. Whether it is about a novel or even about a person, like an intellectual biography of their life. But it must be interesting to do it with someone not only who's still alive, but you can talk to and maybe ask a question about it.
Yeah, absolutely, and it's so helpful.
That makes sense.
I think there's both Martina, who I mentioned earlier, and I probably felt a little nervous about it
Right.
in some ways, and we did have others help with this project. I didn't want to leave them out of it. The full credits are on the website, but we were the ones who were in touch with him, and um, yeah, I think we feel people feel a little nervous proposing an interpretation to an author, or
Right.
not being sure about what was in the text. But again, just found them really friendly and supportive, and uh, yeah, eager in some ways to answer our questions and point us in the right directions,
Right.
or verify.
Right. That's really cool. Um, so I have to go from this to kind of a hard question. I'm sure you've done it many times before. I've read you do it in other places, but we normally at this point in the podcast, I would either summarize or I would ask, guests like yourself to summarize what the plot of the novel is. But in this case, I think that would be pretty much almost impossible without either being here for a couple hours, mangling the book, or doing, or even really just doing it a major disservice. Not that I think that like the book's plot is unimportant, but I did want to take a line from this article, Sokolov's A School for Fools, An Escape from Socialist Realism, not for, written by the translator of the NYB edition, Alexander Boguslavsky, who articulates my reaction better than I can. Quote, it is one of those difficult books which neglect plot and action, force the reader into a time-consuming, meticulous study of the textual images and motifs, a situation which often leads to abandoning the reading altogether. So, having admittedly kind of set you up for failure, could you introduce A School for Fools to the listeners?
Yeah, I can try. Alongside that quote, I definitely don't want to turn off any listeners or potential readers from A School for
Right.
Fools. It's untraditional. It's difficult in some ways, but again, I think it really rewards reading
Yeah.
on various levels. Um, maybe you can attest to that after if I miss anything here. But
No, absolutely.
um,
I mean, I will say, sorry, I should have at the end. Whenever I talk about how weird or strange or difficult to read this book is, I always mean that with the parentheses positive.
yeah, it's
Yeah.
complimentary.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, I love weird stuff. So
Yeah.
yeah, on kind of basic level,
Mm,
it's a story of
mm,
um, a character named
mm,
Student So and So, who also goes by Nymphaea, who is of an indeterminate age, where
mm,
it's somewhat unclear what his age is. Um, Seems to be a student, but also claims to be an engineer, so an adult or in his 20s or something like that. Um, and it recounts various moments in his life. A
mm,
tricky thing is that in this novel, time doesn't operate in the way it normally does. The narrator, student so and so, can kind of jump around from a moment from his childhood to another moment where he seems to be older and has a car, or claims to have a car, those sorts of things. Um, Alongside this, uh, his narration, if not his mind, seem to be bifurcated. There's two versions of student so and so who converse. They talk
mm,
to each other. Um, you might argue that they're different. One seems to critique the other one's flights of fancy, those sorts of things, but um, the language is pretty consistent. So
mm,
it's essentially all this character. Um, so yeah, so character is not what it normally is. Time is not what it normally is.
mm,
There's no linear plot. Kind of jumps around and is tied by various motifs and themes. There are certainly scenes that play out. Some
mm,
feel like more of digressions than others, but we kind of trace these moments in his life. Like some of the crucial ones are his interactions with his teacher, um, Narviegev,
mm,
uh, interactions with his parents, his really strict father, and his
mm,
mother, who seems to support him in some ways.
mm,
Um, uh, his fascination and attempts to sort of reach this woman that he loves, Yetta,
mm,
who's a teacher but also seems to be a railway prostitute,
mm,
and all the characters take different forms. Um, Yeah, and if I'm reducing things even further, there are five chapters. The second one is a series of vignettes
mm,
that seem to represent moments from the novel or characters from the novel. The other four chapters, I mean, but from uh, a different perspective.
mm.
What on first glance seems to be more realistic and detached, and not as uh, strange and skewed perspective as student so and so's.
The relationship with time, I'll maybe ask you. I'm going to ask you more about that in a second. But that was something that I struggled to do throughout this book, was try to let go of trying to piece together the chronology, because eventually I kind of came to the conclusion it doesn't matter as much as the moment we're kind of experiencing now. But there was like this little trick in the beginning of this book that kept setting me up, where we have I forget, he's talking about at the student so is talking about the railway station, the markings on the train, and you have a little parenthesis and starts telling a story about all the people writing in chalk and where the chalk comes from. And then like 2 pages later, suddenly goes, oh right, I should end this parenthesis. I should bring the other parenthesis back. And then it ends and goes back to the story I was telling before, and I'd completely forgotten. Oh, we were in a totally different part of the story. And that little moment, there were moments later on where we suddenly are like in a conversation with Veda's father, and my mind is like, wait a minute, is everything that has happened in between the last time we talked to him and now, is that all a digression in the mind before coming back to the same conversation? But I was like trying to let go some of this tendency at the same time, that at least that little parenthesis trick. Maybe trick isn't the wrong word. I loved it. I thought it was great. At the beginning of the novel, kept me in a little bit, hooked me just slightly.
Right. Yeah. No, that's good to hear. Yeah, and I do think sort of letting go
Mm.
the expectations of what a novel should be is really
Mm.
helpful, and that has to do with character and time, and whether a character is alive or dead.
Mm.
His teacher, uh, student so and so's teacher Nedviegev, seems to be conversing with student so and so even after he's died.
Mm.
Um, if you can let go of those sorts of things and just appreciate the novel on its own terms,
Mm.
I think that's the way to go about it. Certainly, initially on a first read, it might be disorienting, um, but that's okay too. You know.
I think that the disorientation is fun for its own right. Where it's kind of nice to encounter a piece of art which thoroughly rejects everything you've been kind of trained by just being around all pieces of media which tend to follow rules, and suddenly something which is like, hey, we don't have to do that.
Right.
Is
Right.
nice. Before we continue on, I had kind of more of a personal question, which was how did you get introduced to School for Fools, and also one of my favorite questions to ask: what was your immediate reaction to reading it, if you can recall now?
Yeah. No. Absolutely. I totally can. I first read it when I think I was preparing for my preliminary exams in graduate school,
Mm,
so the exams we would take before starting our dissertation.
mm,
Um, it was around that time anyway, and maybe a professor had suggested it, or I had read it in, one of the histories of Russian literature that I was
mm,
studying for those exams. I read about it. It sounded, right up my alley.
mm,
It's modernist, postmodernist novel that plays with time and chronology and those sorts of things.
mm,
Um, and I was also looking for texts that I might include in my dissertation, which was on James Joyce and Russian literature.
mm,
So it sounded perfect. So I actually took it with me on spring break to Ireland.
mm,
This was a celebration for finishing the prelim exams.
mm,
So I took a copy with me. I think I started it my first night there,
mm.
and just reading the first few pages, I was like, "This is it. This is amazing. This is one of my favorite novels, probably at this point." Just reading a tiny bit. So I loved it. To get to your second question,
Mm.
um, and B, it was clear that this would fit into what I was going to be writing about for the dissertation.
Right. That makes sense. That's got to be a pretty good feeling to kind of, I don't know if striking gold is overstating it, but like, wow, this is perfect.
Yeah, it was
Yeah.
literary gold. It was exciting.
Yeah, that makes sense. You mentioned a little earlier this. We've been talking about this novel's relationship with time, but maybe we should expand on it. Which I do. I've seen some other authors argue that getting too caught up on it is missing the forest for the trees. Like but we can't avoid it. It's an integral part of the novel. But not something you should stop at. But it is something that is not only a feature of it, but is also discussed in the book itself, with, I think, if I recall correctly, student so and so saying, "Oh, I read this philosopher, and I think maybe later is revised too. I read one page, or I opened up the page, and I immediately knew that time is not as we have presented it as, and isn't it so arbitrary? Just that the idea that one day follows the other."
Yeah, yeah, and you're right. This is an idea that the narrator student so and so is sort of fascinated by, and he also
Mm,
refers to what's wrong with his
mm,
his memory or his head,
mm, mm,
and that this is something he's inherited from his grandmother. Um, so yeah, it's a gift or a quality of his
mm,
mind that for him time doesn't move linearly, but rather he sort of can drop in at these various moments of his life and experience them.
mm,
Um, Maybe iteratively, we have these moments that recur, these conversations that he has with his teacher, for instance, in the school bathroom, um, um, or other events. The
mm,
character, student so and so's mind sort of gives
mm,
shape to the novel. The structure and the content are really closely intertwined in the book.
mm,
Um, and then on I guess another higher level,
mm,
I think time is certainly, and I'm not the first to say this, time is
mm,
certainly one of Sokolov's primary themes. It's something that
mm,
absolutely fascinates him. Um, and as with many other things, he resists,
mm,
the traditional approach to time and linearity in um, fiction. That think that you have to go from A to B to C.
mm,
Instead of doing that, why not go A to C and then return to,
mm,
I don't know, Z,
mm,
heading backwards in a different direction.
Yeah, that's something that struck me in that there is throughout this novel, the main character, student so and so, is resistant. He is, of course, going to this so-called, as he terms it, the school for fools, with other students as well, and it has an extremely negative reaction to this attempt to make him kind of fit into. I guess it's weird because he simultaneously imagines himself as an engineer or a biologist, or I forget what the word is for someone who studies butterflies, but
entomologist.
Yeah, thank you. Perfect. Like someone who is kind of this member of society as he would expect it to be, largely in relation to Veta. Like, okay, this would make me worthy of her. But at the same time, this resistance to that attempt of the school making him, otherwise he kind of refers to everyone else around him as not the other students, but the wider world as fools. Like his father seems to kind of serve this as this somewhat negative force of him always coming in and kind of being this figure of like, why isn't this the quote unquote the trombonist, the student who plays like a piece of wire? Why if I would put him to work if I was in control? And I've seen the argument that this is a resistance to Soviet norms. I think you could generalize that out to all norms of all societies, but also the it seems to me like a resistance to the like time itself, that everyone else is sticking to. Like the father is like, well, I've got to keep my timetable for my job. I've got to live this normal life. And that itself seems like an impressive force to student so-and-so, who's like you say, it's like this kind of gift of being able to see the world in other ways and not have to exist in that same day to day that a lot of these other characters do. Although certainly there are other characters who seem to exist outside of that, like the teacher, who's kind of looked at negatively, I'll say very, very lightly, for not conforming to what everyone else is doing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's all true. And the key part is that, like you said, that this isn't just a response to the Soviet
Soviet society, maybe.
Yeah, Soviet society. It's riddled, maybe is not the right word. It's full of references to Soviet society and Soviet context and those sorts of things. So of course it's connected to all of that. But like you, I think, very rightly said, what it's championing is, if it's championing anything, it is independence and freedom of thought, and that's not limited to that context. It's about student so and so and the author sort of going their own way, quite literally in a way on its last pages. But yeah, it's not limited to what Stalin or later Soviet leaders were doing or demanding of Soviet citizens. It's really about seeing the world in a unique fashion for each individual, and giving expression to that and giving voice to that artistically. That again, if anything, is I think what Sokolov is suggesting with the school for fools.
Yeah, there's this line, I think it's Norvegov, the teacher, who says it early in the novel, shortly before his death, which is retold over and over in slightly different forms at some point. I think it's him who says something to the effect of, beware, friends, there is no happiness in the world, nothing like that. But instead, Lord, there is, after all, peace and freedom. And that line, peace and freedom, I saw pop up a couple of times, which is kind of what led me to that of this. I mean, I don't necessarily think there's a like a dialogue of what is happiness here, but I think there is the implication that what is like the happiness is what you should be, and what you should be is a productive member of society, which is kind of why I've seen the argument that this is specifically anti-Soviet society. But the thing that strikes me is like the features they're discussing are not unique to Soviet. It's like the feature of Soviet society that was important for differentiating it is not that you had to go to work every day. That's a bit more universal. But like that the freedom, especially the peace in your own mind of not having to give that up, kind of at least push me in that direction.
Yeah, absolutely.
Excellent. I also moving on from the chronology into the student so-and-so and his double, At the beginning of the episode, I described it as the book as a sort of a conversation between, the narrator and his double, which, saying a conversation tends to imply talking. But I don't think it also would be unreasonable to approach it as a mental conversation. That's kind of how I mentally categorized it. However, I have here another article which suggests a slightly different understanding, not necessarily maybe mutually exclusive, but another understanding that I suspect that you might agree with. The title is The Embodied Language of Sasha Sokolov's A School for Fools, written by one José Vergara. And I was wondering if you could talk about your argumentation in this piece.
Sure. Thanks for bringing it up. Um, yeah, so as I mentioned briefly earlier, I think so much of this novel, just like all of Sokolov's work, is about language and what language can do, and play with language, how one word can lead to another just by association, the sound, etc. This again is something that many critics have said about his work, and a common thing to say about his work is that language is the true hero in the sense of like a narrator or character. We have student so and so, but he's so mercurial, and he has a double, and it's unclear what exactly he is. We don't know what age he is. We don't know what he is, and for his profession, those sorts of things. But the kind of one constant throughout the whole novel and throughout Sokolov's work is language, and the sort of fascination and respect and adoration of what the word, the written word, and what the word can do. So that was kind of a starting point for this article that I wrote, which focused on language in A School for Fools. And what I was interested in is the idea of, or the question of, what exactly is this book? Like you said, maybe it's what it's representing. It could be a conversation in the sense of this character student so and so talking to himself, to sides of his mind, talking to his teacher, to his parents, etc. Or is it all in his head? It's a mental conversation, like you said. Or what I was interested in, kind of working through and considering in that article is this sort of a written representation of one of those options of his thoughts, etc. Is this meant to be some sort of written text that we're getting? If that makes sense. Like obviously it's a novel. Obviously it's a book with words on the page.
Right.
But is conceptually, is it meant to be a representation of what's in his head? So I look at various moments in the text where there's like the narrator screaming, student so and so screaming into a barrel, or train sounds or music sounds, onomatopoeia, or various physical, written in the sense of written representations of sounds. So we see it as they would be written. So in that sense, how is this a conversation that doesn't quite align? Things like that. And then also what I see as various metaphors for like words on a page, black letters on white images. That's a kind of recurring motif throughout the book. This contrast with black and white, words on a page, this idea of writing. And I think ultimately I see one way to look at this novel as this sort of desire, or aim to, or aspiration to give body to language, to the word, to go from sort of ideal form to a concrete form. And this happens certainly in terms of the language and writing, but also the kind of love or desire, again, keep returning to that word, that student so-and-so feels for Vieta. And there's a vignette in particular, in that chapter 2, that deal with this as well. This like moment where you go from seeing someone or something or an idea from afar and it's sort of shielded and away from you, and you can't touch it, to making contact and
Mm,
having it be embodied in front of you.
mm.
This probably sounds sort of heady and strange and whatever, but basically, I'm arguing that language is all over this
Yeah.
fascination with language is all over the novel on these various levels. Yeah.
Yeah. And well, when I was reading it, I was really struck by thinking back on the novel. Like, oh, that's the one thing you mentioned in the piece is that even in sections where punctuation is otherwise totally eschewed, and even like standards of grammar, like sentences will, you could maybe call it a stream of consciousness style, although we'll talk about that in a second. Of like kind of stopping mid sentence and then continuing on with no stoppage. If there's a title or something where there would otherwise, the written word would demand a dash, like a dash in a title of a sign, or like you're saying, the onomatopoeias. Those are still there, which I was like, oh, that is an interesting. And it feels intentional. I think the moment I knew I was going to love this book was very early on when, I think in like the very opening pages, it's like outside of the general kind of strangeness of the book, it's fairly traditional in the way it's written. And then suddenly you get to this moment where the sentences get longer and they're connected not by periods, but it's one long sentence with em dashes and semicolons. And then suddenly you start, there's no punctuation at all. And then that's going into that style, which sounds just like, like this thought process of constant interruption, stopping in the middle, continuing on, conversation. And looking back on that, at the time it felt intentional as like as a piece of writing. Suddenly the pace is accelerating or moving faster and faster. But I was looking back on that in the context of your article. It's like, oh, that maybe more than intentional than on the author's part. Maybe intentional in the context of theoretically the author of the piece inside the text itself.
Yeah, I think so. There's yeah, it, both in this, well, all three of his novels, but the two I've looked at most closely are School for Fools and
Mm,
Between Dog and Wolf, and
mm,
there's so many details and so much care, I think
mm.
is one word for it, and then attention to how all the pieces fit together. I think is just masterfully crafted,
Right.
and that's something else to appreciate about it. Just so I think Sokolov is, of course, very intentional in how all these pieces came together.
Mm. Yeah, absolutely. I've got to say, I write for a living, but I write for like standard. I live and die by the AP Style Guide, and I love getting to read books like this because it's really refreshing to see someone who appreciates the way the interaction between language and grammar on a page and uses that to maybe to say have fun is way too light, way too reductive, but like it's fun to read it and get to realize the potential of all these things that are normally, if A, then do this, if B, then this, if C,
Yeah,
then
yeah,
this.
yeah,
Rules for grammar.
totally.
Okay, so I have a question that's not very serious, but it is a little bug in my bonnet, and I wanted to I think you might be one of the best people to ask this question. I normally do not read promotional quotes on books, but this one did catch my eye. From Vladimir Markov. If Joyce had written the last chapter of Ulysses in Russian, it would have sounded like this. Someone who is a specialist on both this novel, Slavic and Russian literature in general, and Ulysses. Excuse me, Joyce. Would you do you think that stands up?
Uh, I do think it's a oversimplification,
Mm,
perhaps. I get it. It's a good
mm,
hook, probably, to
right,
appeal to Joyce fans.
right.
Um, there's definitely some parallels here
Mm,
to what Joyce does, and the idea of stream of consciousness, and
mm,
again, whether this is in the character's mind and this is the free flow of what's going on in his head. Um, Maybe I should also
mm,
say, for those who haven't read Ulysses, the final chapter of Ulysses, the final episode,
mm,
so-called episode, is traditionally held up as like one of the I don't know, exemplars of stream of consciousness
mm,
writing. So um, just a sort of free flow
mm,
of the character Molly Bloom's thoughts in the middle of the night, thinking about her life, her husband,
mm,
her daughter, her deceased son, various acquaintances, various events in her life, etc., and just flows and flows and flows goes
Mm.
the metaphor. Um, so we do see some of that here.
Mm.
There's what you alluded to earlier, these
Mm.
moments where the punctuation drops out, just like in
Mm.
Ulysses, and it becomes this chain of associations. Um, so you can see it in
Mm.
certain ways. But I think one way to distinguish between the two, and there are several at least, um, something I forgot to mention earlier,
Mm.
that Sokolov refers to his writing as um,
Mm.
poesia, this combination of prose and poetry.
Mm.
Um, I think there's certainly poetry and maybe some elements of
Mm.
similar poetry in Ulysses. Um, but again, this is the focus of Sokolov. So, uh, so an example is in School for Fools. Yes, there's this
Mm.
chain of associations, chain of ideas that um, uh, come out of student so and so's mind, or there in his mind, as we were saying, or end up on the page
Mm.
from his mind, whatever it might be. Um, but quite often, if not always, the association is based on sound.
Mm.
Um, so one of the main examples is the character Vieta. She appears in association the first time, if I'm recalling correctly, with the railway branch.
Mm.
And in Russian, branch is Vietka,
Mm.
Vetka.
Mm.
Um, so a certain sound or part of a word, that phoneme will generate another word or
Mm.
even a character. And out of this is how the text and the texture of the novel sort of blossoms
Mm.
or blooms. Now I'm mixing Joyce here. Um, the character bloom.
Mm.
Um, uh, I don't think that
Mm.
that's what happens in
Mm.
Ulysses. Maybe there's a more of that happening in Finnegan's Wake, where it
Mm.
is very much more about um, language and these sorts of associations between sounds in multiple languages.
Mm.
Um, yeah, so this is a long-winded way of saying that I see some
Mm.
similarities between what Markov mentions there
Mm.
about the last. If Joyce had written the last chapter of Ulysses in Russian, it would have sounded like this. But there are just as many differences and sort of nuances to Sokolov's writing that this flattens out. And the stream of consciousness is part of that, at least.
Right. Actually, now that since you mentioned stream of consciousness, maybe this is a good time to talk about another piece that you wrote that addresses this sort of element, other things as well. But Sasha Sokolov, Here Comes Everybody Meets Those Who Came, which has a piece of argumentation about the idea that what the narration is at times in A School for Fools is stream of consciousness. And I was wondering if you could talk about your argumentation there.
Yeah, so this is a chapter from the book, my book,
Mm.
about James Joyce and Russian literature.
Mm.
And in it, I think, to some extent, it's along the lines of what we've been talking about, that sort of working through whether or not the concept of stream of consciousness applies to A School for Fools,
Mm.
the literary technique. Stream of consciousness, this free flow of one thought leading to another, and so on. And again, I think in A School for Fools, it's very much rooted in sound play and associations between
Mm.
words and those sorts of things, rather than real interest in
Mm.
the, I guess, physical or real
Mm.
world of the novel. It's not at all
Mm.
about that. Um, Not that the characters and what happens to them doesn't matter, but
Mm.
it's uh, that's not the focus by any
Mm.
means. Yeah.
Yeah, that tracks. Speaking of Veta, I did want to ask, and sorry, this is kind of throwing like throwing a hand grenade in your lap because this is a big question I didn't quite know how to formulate. How do you understand like Veta's place in the obviously we talked a little bit about there, but she's this recurring character who never actually appears. Her standing below her window, yes. Her father, yes. Evidence of her existence, theoretically, yes, but of course never actually appears, and yet is such a central character in her own right.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, compared to the other characters, she's non-existent or not physically embodied in similar ways. Um, One way to read the whole novel is that this is all just happening in student so-and-so's mind. It's just not speculation, but his imagination sort of running wild. So in that sense, they're all the same. But yet I think even more than the other characters for student so-and-so seems to be this ideal, the sort of romanticized image of this woman. One thread of the novel is him coming to terms with or coming to understand sex and sexuality. He seems to really fear it for most of the novel. And again, the chronology complicates this, but he's asking, mentor figures about basically sex, how to have sex, what it means to have sex. And he wants to propose to Vieta and asks her father, who's also a scientist, a rehabilitated scientist. He had been arrested and came back. He asked him for Vieta's hand in marriage and wants to pursue this. So yeah, I think within the world of the novel and within student so-and-so's mind, which very well may be the same thing again, she's this ideal that he's pursuing, but also sort of resists because the idea of sex and the idea of making contact with something real is terrifying and foreign to him for, I guess, for most of the novel.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up Vieta's father too, because that was an interesting. That was. I had to think back to the episode we did with Sarah, mostly talking about Nabokov's signs and symbols, and trying to resist that urge, especially here to read these scenes and start putting these things together as if it's a puzzle. And because the sense I got when we meet Vieta's father, well, he comes out of the house to find student so-and-so screaming into their, was it the beer barrel or the empty fire barrel?
The rain barrel, yeah.
The rain barrel, yes. Is that he comes out and then starts proposing to him like, oh, well, let me show you my invention, and it's a sharp stick to pick up things. And he's asking if he should patent it. My mind was almost like, is this an invention? Is this actually an interaction with another student who's being, misidentified here? But then I was like, okay, I need to resist this urge to try to act as if there's a secret story behind the story that there is defined. But all the same, it is this fascinating bit of conversation, which really reflects so-and-so or student so-and-so's interaction with his teacher in this way that it's so hard to, because at least for the teacher, you've got, okay, he's alive, he's dead, he's not dead, but also at some point he comes to terms with the fact that he's dead while still talking to so-and-so and kind of seems to almost act as if there's a disconnect between him and the rest of the world and talking about my memory is not quite there. I don't seem to remember things after a certain point. And there's something similarly strange about this interaction with the father, where he's also seems not quite all there, which maybe you could attribute towards the years of being beaten in prison or in the hospital, whatever the case was for him. But he also seems similarly not quite in changes, sometimes quite present normally, sometimes a little not quite all there. And that was something I was trying to, I struggled to come to terms with in understanding in the novel.
Yeah, and another element, right, is that his double, many of the characters are doubled. His double is Leonardo da Vinci, the artist. So, yeah, we have that too.
Right. Yeah. It always gets, every time I think I understand it, I realize it's a little bit more difficult. but also sometimes strangely easy to understand in a way. There's something that I was going to make the comparison. This reminded me a lot of Italo Calvino's writing, but then you made it in, I think, in your book as well, and I was like, dang, it's a derivative statement now, but it did remind me a lot of reading Invisible Cities. This sort of, although Invisible Cities obviously is quite different in context, but in this, I don't know, slow reveal is not the right word, but
Yeah, I think with Calvino,
mm,
there's something. I haven't read all of Calvino,
mm,
but you know, much of it I think is sort of mathematical, and it's linked to his association with the Oulipo, this
right.
group of mathematicians and writers. So the way it's structured is so um, algorithmic.
Mm,
Often, like if on a winter's night, one story leading to other, those sorts of things, intentionally. So there's nothing
mm,
wrong with that. Um, with Sokolov, I think. I mean, on the one hand, it
mm,
feels very intuitive, right?
mm,
It's structured like it feels more organic the way these associations happen, and they're rooted in language and so on.
mm,
Um, on the other, of course, he had to think about it and put it
mm.
together manually, so to speak.
Right.
Um, uh, yeah, I was also thinking more about the comparison to Ulysses, and
Mm,
one um, one reading or one suggestion that's been made about Ulysses is that we have to comprehend it sort of sculpturally, basically as a
mm,
sort of 3D object. So you have to consider a moment at the beginning of the novel alongside a moment in the middle, and one three quarters, and one at the very end, and see them
mm,
all in connection to one another rather than A to B to C again.
mm,
Um, and I think that's similar to School for Fools, that
mm,
since chronology isn't linear, it in some ways takes more work. But if you um, sort of trace these motifs and themes and images that recur, that can be really helpful. And I think
mm,
that's the way it's actually structured. That we have these recurring images of, for instance,
mm,
um, the snow butterflies
mm,
that student so and so catches allegedly, or a little girl petting a dog that
mm,
sometimes becomes a doe.
mm.
Um, I don't know what else. The river,
Right.
these various images. If as you read along, I think tracing those at least mentally,
Mm,
if you want to write them out, great.
mm,
In my margins, I mark these sorts of things.
mm.
Um, that's really useful and sort of
Right.
gives you a better sense of the shape of the novel.
Hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. That's so okay. Cool tip for one all of you. Once you go, obviously go out and pick up this novel right after getting this, which I think you should. I did. Okay. I have a super general question because I was sitting down and I was looking at all the different kind of themes, elements, pieces of the text itself that I want to talk about, and I was like, there's too many here, and I kind of wanted to get your opinion on angles you might focus on for maybe better understanding the novel, things that you just kind of like to talk about the novel. If there's just anything of that kind of wide range of things you could talk about that you would want to highlight. Like I would love to, like if I had to pick one, it would be the time he just tells a woman's life story in his series, like just one single list separated by commas and of sentences, or I guess it's forgetting my parts of speech, like dependent clauses like that are roughly the same length and such an like an amazing just one of those amazing kind of digressions away from the main text. I don't. What kind of strikes you in a similar vein?
Yeah, I do also love that passage,
Mm,
just reduction of a life to a
mm,
list. Something sad about it, but also beautiful at
right.
the same time.
It's like kind of sad and beautiful to see like someone's life reduced to a list, but in the same way, the list that feels good, that feels like it captures like a complexity of a life in a way that
Absolutely.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I guess certainly as you read and
Mm,
you start noticing a recurring image, one that
mm,
you appreciate, hold on to that and see where else it pops up.
mm,
Um, I think, something fun to my mind and related to
mm,
that first thing about the images is that second chapter that I mentioned consists of these vignettes that are called um, they're subtitled the stories written on the veranda that seem to tell other elements of the characters' lives from a different perspective. I think that's another way that you can go about it, or that's also um, uh, generative and fruitful. As you read the second chapter, you already notice connections, I think, to the first one, but then moving forward, you'll recognize like there's uh, uh, someone who excavates. He's a excavation digger, a glass installer. There seems to be there is the prosecutor, the student so and so's father appears there as well. References to his attitude toward his in-laws, his family, and those sorts of things. Um, so you can make those connections from that second chapter outward to chapter one, and then chapters 3, 4, and 5, and think about those questions. Like, what is reality here? Is what's presented in chapter 2 more real, in air quotes, than the other chapters, or what's presented in the other chapters? Or is it the other way around? Those sorts of things. And I think that relationship between those two sets of chapters also speaks to kind of a structural principle of the novel, that there are moments housed within other moments, conversations housed with other moments, like you said, with the parenthetical digressions, those sorts of things. I think that's also another fun and fascinating element of the novel, that what you think you're reading something that's sort of external to you're somehow in the top layer, but then suddenly there are these parentheses and you realize you're encased within a broader story. So tracing and tracking those moments as these switches can also be useful.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, thank you. I was gonna ask you about how you see chapter 2 fitting into the rest of the novel, but you kind of gotten at that. Where I'm still trying to wrestle with it, especially that question of reality, and also asking, does reality matter in this particular case more than other features that we're getting at here? But I think that's a nice encapsulation of kind of, I don't want to say the purpose it serves, because I feel like that would imply there's a singular purpose, but in understanding its relationship to the rest of the pieces, because initially that really stands out. This style, which almost seems it's not bad writing. It's not droll. It feels droll in relation to this really rich, vivid inner world we get to live in and kind of bask in for the rest of the novel. And suddenly here you're like, it's almost like this was an initial reaction, which is not related to anything, how anyone should understand the book at all, but it almost felt like someone rewriting big novels down into, what if we just reduce them down to their basic component parts of this character interaction without much inner life. There's, of course, inner life depicted, which I don't think is a valid reading, but that was kind of it was such a stark change.
Yeah, and I do remember myself feeling kind of shocked going from chapter 1, student so and so's story and his narration, and then all of a sudden being presented with these vignettes, these short, brief accounts of they're essentially all focused on one character and their a moment in their life. It's much less capacious than the rest of the novel. Yeah, and I've wondered what to do with that, and also wondered who is the voice behind these. And then we get to chapter 3, and it's back to students and so and what happens there. So yeah, the other big question is who writes these, who presents these stories written on the veranda. The veranda is referenced elsewhere in the novel, so again, there's these connections between different parts of the structure of the novel.
Right. Was there that line later on where it's the veranda is labeled the summer reading veranda and student so and so thinks, so that's stupid. Who would read a veranda in the summer?
Yeah, yeah,
Maybe it's for writing in the summer. Who knows?
right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So many questions, and like you said, there's not. I don't think a single interpretation, but these many possibilities are exciting. I think for readers.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's one of the things that struck me about this. I was having similar. I was kind of expressing something similar when in the last episode I did on Alexander Dovzhenko's. I've just forgotten that. I want to say Arsenal and Zvenihora, but Earth, Zemlya. In reading so many different people coming from completely different angles of interpretation, which are not necessarily mutually exclusive from each other. Just kind of basking in the excitement and joy and being able to kind of play with it mentally like that, which is what strikes me here. Like when I'm reading it, when now going back and thinking on it, I'm thinking, none of these characters within chapter 2 recur, we think, as far as we know, with the exception of this, well, maybe calling the soldiers the wrong term, the teenager who goes away to serve his term of service and comes back in the final story and has a much sadder life at that point. But still kind of wrangling with that, which is, I guess, the fun thing. I walk away and I'm still trying to resist the urge to act like there's a true story underneath, but also piecing together what am I understanding from this, which is, I guess, probably kind of one of the major things of this novel in general.
Yeah, there's an essay or a lecture essay that Sokolov wrote, delivered, published, in which he speaks about wanting to do away basically with plot and sort of these core essential elements of fiction and throwing those to whoever wants them, masses, I think is how he puts it. But for him, what's left is the how, the structure, how pieces are put together, and kind of experimentation with form and language again. That's how all these texts are constructed and built up, and really what's most important to him, at least.
That makes sense. Well, I think there's a lot more things to talk about, but maybe this is a good place to leave it for now. But before I let you go, Jose, I was just wondering if there's anything that you're working on that people should look forward to.
Sure. I'll be brief.
Take all the time you need.
My main research project right now is on, and maybe I mentioned this the last time too, so it's a promise I'll fulfill someday. But, another book project on contemporary Russian prison writing, chipping away at that. Something anyone is interested can actually look at now, is another set of annotations, this time on the films of Paul Thomas Anderson. So There Will Be Blood, Inherent Vice, The Master, those sorts of films, Punch Drunk Love. And those are some of them. This is a work in progress in collaboration with a bunch of people. Those are available on ptannotated.com. So not at all related to Slavic literature, not part of my Russian literature side.
But it's great. I love that.
Yeah, it's been really fun to work on. It, a continuation of this fascination with annotating and that kind of approach to scholarship. Yeah, it's fun, and it's open access. It's available online for anyone to make use of, and we'll be building it out over a number of years probably, but some of them are now available.
I'm definitely going to go look that up, because actually it's kind of funny. I've never been a huge film person, but in the last year I've tried to. There's a micro theater down the street from my apartment where they show old and foreign films, and my wife and I have a membership there, so we try to go see something with no context, and that led us into a Charlie Kaufman rabbit hole, which we're trying to finish up. And after that we did that, we were like, okay, now we need to. Everyone's talking about Paul Thomas Anderson. We know very little about film. We got to start watching our way through. My only context being Inherent Vice and One Battle After Another. So I need to watch a couple more films and go to that website myself.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, let me know what you think.
Absolutely. Thank you. Cool. Well, I think maybe that's we'll wrap it up there on the most important topic of School for Fools, Paul Thomas Anderson. Well,
Yeah.
Jose, thank you for being here today.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much for having me again. It's always a lot of fun.
And before I let you go, I wanted to give you some quick insight into what we're covering next time. We are continuing our coverage of Sasha Sokolov, this time moving to Between Dog and Wolf, probably utilizing some of those resources that Jose mentioned. So I'm looking forward to it. Podcasting isn't expensive, but it's also not free. To keep this show independent, you can head on over to slaviclitpod.com and find ways to support us there. For everyone who already does financially support us, thank you. And the music, as always, is Staraya Kino by Peremotka. You can find notes and spelling in the show notes. You'll hear from me again soon.